So we're going to talk about drawing humans today, and we're going super low tech because I can't figure out how to do this on my computer, and I want you guys to have access to this. So when you're drawing humans, it's important to think of them in shapes first and then details. And so one of the first things I like to do is when I'm drawing out my piece of paper, we're going to pretend this is a piece of paper, I like to mark out like how tall do I want that human to be at the end of things, so that way we don't have a situation where you end up going off the piece of paper. So that's going to be how tall my human is. So it's something called a bounding box if you draw a box around it, or just marking the height if that's something that is more comfortable to you. Next thing to know is that human heads are about 1/7, so 7.5 to 8 heads will fit within a human body. Obviously that depends on the person, but we're going to call it that for now. So we've got if we go to about there, that should be about how tall our human is, and that seems really big, but as we start adding in those features, it'll make more sense. So the first thing I like to do is think about the fact that we have a neck, and if you feel right next to the sides of your neck, you can feel that it's going to connect more at your jawbone than it will right in the middle of your head. If that were where your neck were, you would probably have a broken spine because it would just like fall off because your head weighs like 10 to 15 pounds. Next thing I like to do is draw in my shoulders, and for most people it's going to be about 2.5 heads wide is the top of that torso. So if I've got 1 and then 2.5-ish, I'm going to make them a little bit more narrow shouldered for this one. And then we can draw a connecting line here. Again, that connecting line is a little bit curved because we have things like muscles that hold our body together. So already we've got a nice torso starting to happen here. About halfway down, so halfway between the top of our head and here, we're going to insert a pelvis, and that's going to be right inside, usually, those shoulder areas. So that's going to go up a little bit. So for males, I like to usually draw a rectangle. Females, I'll draw an oval. Mainly that's just because of the fact that guys for the most part are more angular and females usually have a bit more curves. Then we can connect that torso to our pelvis because that's what happens when we have a spine. And then I'll draw in 2 more joints. And so this is where like that pelvis is starting to get into legs. And then halfway between my pelvis bottom and the bottom of my thing here, I'll add in my knees. If you feel next to your body about just almost at mid-rise, we're going to have those elbows come in. And then about mid-thigh is where we'll get a hand. And so I'm going to just draw kind of an elongated triangle here for my hands. And then from there, we have our feet coming in, and I'm actually going to make our guy a little taller because he's looking a little funny right now. And that's why it's like 7.5 to 8, is that it can change a little bit depending on the proportions of your body. When we go to connect my arms, I'm going to come from the outside of my shoulder to the middle of that bone, or the middle of that joint. And the reason I do that is because we've got more muscle on the inside of our arm, and so I want to make sure that I leave enough room for that here, and I don't just put a stick straight through it where I can't really put some muscle. And then same thing with our forearm. We're going to draw in that connecting line. The reason I like to do a skeletal system before my muscles is because of the fact that then I can work with how I'm going to position this person, and make sure that they actually fit together right. So when I draw in those quads, same kind of thing. I'm coming from the outside, and from the shins, coming from the outside of that joint into the middle of my foot joint. So this has a nice basic skeletal structure. I can start going in and adding some muscles. So I'm going to soften up some of these lines. Depending on how much muscle you have, it might change. And so definitely if you're drawing a specific person, look at that person. That's the best way to learn how to draw them, is looking at them, not what you think that they should look like. So I'm going to go in and add some definition here. And then we're going to have the quads come in. The quads usually have quite a bit of muscle because they're pretty big muscles in general. And then we've got more meat on the outside of our calves than we do on the inside. So I'm going to have actually a little bit of excess muscle come in on my calf there. And then my feet are going to stay pretty much the same. I'm almost drawing them like duck fins because of the fact that we don't need to get too much into detail just yet. So then from here I could go in and I could add hair and I could add all kinds of things, but it at least gives us a person to work with, a little skeletal man. So we have a body, so 7.5 to 8 heads high is a good rule of thumb unless you're doing a specific pose. If you're needing a less general thing, then we have a site called Magic Poser. Oops. Poser. And this is an app and a online version, browser version, so you can get both at home. But you can actually design your own little dude and have him do whatever pose you would like, and then you can draw that mannequin. Once we have our body, we'll need to think about our hands and feet. And so for hands and feet, I like to think of them as mittens. And so I'll draw almost a trapezoid shape first. And if we look at our hands, you can almost see a trapezoid inside of there. So from where my pinky and my pointer finger are to where my thumb is, there's a little bit of a trapezoid shape. So I'm going to draw this the direction that my hand is right now. So I've got a little bit of that trapezoid shape for my palm. And then my fingers, if I was drawing my fingers like this, I'm going to put them in a mitten. And if you look at your fingers, they're the same height. So if I've got that height, your palm and your fingers are usually about the same height. And they have a slight curve to the top. That thumb, if we look at our hand, is going to come in about right here. And that's going to give us a nice area on where we can put the thumb part of our mitten. So before I ever draw fingers, this is what I start with. From here, I can decide how I want those fingers to look. But it's going to seem a lot more natural than if I just start with the fingers and then all of a sudden I've got this weird looking octopus hand. 1, oh dear, 2, 3, 4, 5 fingers and a thumb, or 4 fingers and a thumb. Hooray. So we can kind of work with these. This is a rough sketch, but always start with a mitten. If you've got hands doing odd like configurations, you've got someone holding something or things like that, you still start the same. We just know that our trapezoid is going to be a little bit different and those fingers are going to come a little bit differently. We have got a guy doing a thumbs up here. Ooh, thumbs up. But starting with those basic shapes is very helpful. Next thing we're going to look at is feet. When we think about feet, sometimes it's easy to draw like a shoe like this, where it's just sitting up in thin air, but that's only for ballerinas. So when we're thinking about shoes, I like to start with a little bit of a flattened box at an angle, because of the fact that with foreshortening, in order for something to be coming at us in the picture, we want to have it be a little bit squished, and that's what forces our eye to think that way. It's called perspective and foreshortening. So from here, I know that my toe is going to be about this big. I can add some sole on there. My foot is going to come back here. This is if I was doing a shoe, obviously. But I can add the tongue of that shoe, and then have my leg come out of there and do a little bit of cleanup. But for the most part, that box is going to give me a pretty darn good foot shape, which is pretty nice. The next thing we want to talk about is kind of the things that go in our face. So if we've got a face, this is normally what I start with, is a circle. And then think about the direction you want that jawline to come. If we look at this here, this is going to be where our nose starts. So we've got two medial lines. We've got one that comes down the center and one that splits the circle this way. And this is where our eyes are going to end up living. For the most part, I like to go in and just draw a chin line just for kicks and giggles, and it kind of gives me an idea of where I'm ending up. Drawing people's chins is very important because that defines the shape of their face. So for this person, they're going to have a little bit more angular face, because why not? And then they've got a little bit of a dimply chin. Okay. When I'm starting a face, I usually like to start kind of at the distance between the eyes. And so in this case, I'm going to be looking at, let me just solidify that, about like this, because we can fit 5 eyeball lengths in your head. And if you feel your eyeball and find that width, you can fit about 5 within the edge of your face to the center. So if we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so maybe we bring that in just a little bit. Yay, sketching. Okay. So about 5. This is going to show us where our eyeballs live. Actually, that's going to come back out because it's a little toe clove. So your eyeballs are actually orbs in your head, which is kind of cool. And then this distance, if we come down here, is going to be our nose. So that's where our nose is going to end, and right between our chin and our nose is going to be where the lips live. So this is looking kind of scary right now, but it'll get better. The first thing we're going to do here, though, when you're drawing eyes, we've got our orb here. The first thing I like to do is draw the top of my eyelid. And what this does is it helps define how much eye we have showing. The next thing we do is we're going to continue that down and draw in our tear duct. And that's going to give us the direction and angle for our lower lid. And something, if you look at eyeballs, we don't actually have anything that pinches together right here. So I'm actually going to just soften that line a little bit because of the fact that we don't have any like direct pinchy line. And this line right here is also going to be solidified. Next thing I like to do is go in and add an eye crease because of the fact that we don't want to have to go back and do that after eyelashes. That's going to stink. And same thing with our lower lid. I'm going to go in and add a little bit of a waterline here. And the reason we do this is we want it to look like it's actually coming, like it's inside the head and not just tacked on the front. Next thing to think about is that iris is going to be a circle as well, and so we're kind of adding in that iris partially. Unless you're super scared, you're not going to see an iris that looks like this in an eyeball. Like that's like a pretty terrified person. So then we can add in a pupil, and usually those have quite a bit of color added to them. They're pretty black. And so I'm going to actually add in a little bit of a highlight here. It depends on where your light's coming from, but normally there are some highlights in the eyes because of the fact that it is a glossy surface. Next thing that we can do is start working on some of the details in the eyes. And eyes are actually made up of kind of fins or fans. So instead of just like going back and forth like zigzagging, I like to kind of squiggle a little bit because if you've ever looked at macro photos of eyeballs, they're pretty detailed and they have some cool texture to them. So we can add our eyeball texture, getting into shading and all that good stuff. We won't do that right now. And then the last part is going to be eyelashes. When you think about an eyelash, it grows like this out of your lid. So we need to start at the lid, and we're just going to add some flicks. When you get to about the center, it's going to start curving the other direction. And I'm actually going to have each one kind of originate from that eyelid itself. And we don't want to add too many because otherwise you start getting into weird broom looking situation, and we don't want that. So the more time you spend on it, the better. but we don't necessarily need more eyelashes in order to make it look like an eye. And then the last thing to think about is the fact that in order for the shadows in our eyes to, or I'm sorry, the highlights in our eyes to actually look like highlights, our eye can't be pure white. So I'm gonna actually add a little bit of shading to my eyeball. Even though it is a pretty white object, it's not pure white. So something to think about. And so there's an eyeball. The next thing to think about is our nose. So with a nose, I like to, there's not many hard lines on a nose. And so it's important to not overline the nose. So I'll draw in a little kind of like bracket that shows me how wide my nose is. And then how far up do my nostrils go? And how far down does that little septum come? So from there, I can kind of add in some soft sides to the nose, but for the most part, most of what I'm doing is going to be shading using my nostrils as a hard line, and then depending on where that light's coming from, adding in shadow on the sides here to help define that nose. We're going to take over the shoe here because we don't need it anymore. I will say that if you are doing some shading, this is why we practice those value scales, is that you are going to get more control if you can shade and add value by just using your pencil rather than doing what I did as kind of like triage there. The more you can control that pencil, the softer your transitions will be, and you won't have tons and tons of pencil ground into the paper. But the more shadows you add, the more your nose will start to become 3D. But again, look at the nose, don't just think you know what it looks like. And the last one here, we'll go kind of quickly. There's so many ways to draw all of these, but these are the ways that I found to be most helpful. When I'm drawing lips, I will kind of add in the corners of the mouth, and if you follow your eye line straight down, or your pupil line, I'll make those little shadowy areas because that's where our mouth actually goes in, and then the other hard line is right in between where those lips meet. From there, what I like to do is add in some shadow that is in, or some value that are in the shape of the lip for my top lip, because that's going to have a lot more shadow than the bottom lip. Just thinking about how light normally goes. So I'm adding in that value there. And then I also know that, let me erase that line there. I also know that I'm going to hit shadow underneath the lip. So I'm going to lightly start adding shadow underneath that lip to define the bottom lip shape without adding like crazy 1990s lip liner, because we don't necessarily want that. That's when you can go back in, you can add texture, you can have all those nice little lip lines, you can have highlights, all that good stuff. But we're not adding a ton of line, just a lot of value. So hopefully this has helped. I will post a picture as well of the final piece here, but the words are probably going to mean more anyway, just watching the video and practicing. Don't be afraid to practice faces a lot. Practice both eyes, so make sure you're practicing both of them and not just single eyes, because how they relate to each other is definitely super important. And if you need help, definitely let me know. But this has been an intro into how to draw humans.